The morning sun cast long shadows across the tarmac at RAF Greenham Common as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her flight jacket and walked toward the massive B-17 flying fortress that would soon carry her and 9 other crew members into the heart of enemy territory. It was March 15, 1944, and the war in Europe was reaching its most critical phase. But what made this particular morning different wasn't the mission ahead. It was the woman leading it. Sarah Mitchell wasn't supposed to be here. In fact, according to most of the military brass, women weren't supposed to be anywhere near combat aircraft, let alone commanding them. But the Women Airforce Service Pilots program had changed everything, and Sarah had proven herself to be one of the most skilled aviators in the entire organization. Still, that didn't stop the whispers, the sideways glances, and the not-so-subtle comments about her unconventional flying style. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah had grown up on a farm in Kansas, where her father had taught her to fly in an old Piper Cub when she was just 16. Unlike her male counterparts who had learned to fly in military academies with strict adherence to textbook procedures, Sarah had developed her skills through intuition, feel, and an almost supernatural connection to her aircraft. Her instructors had noticed it immediately. She flew by instinct rather than by the book, making decisions that seemed reckless to observers, but somehow always worked out perfectly. Mitchell flies like she's dancing with the plane, her first instructor had noted in her file. Unconventional, but undeniably effective. That comment would follow her throughout her career, sometimes as praise, more often as criticism. The male pilots she flew with couldn't understand how she seemed to coax performance out of aircraft that others couldn't achieve. They watched her pre-flight routines with bewilderment. She would actually place her hands on the fuselage, close her eyes, and seem to listen to the aircraft itself. "She talks to the damn planes," Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison had muttered to his fellow officers after watching Sarah's pre-flight ritual. How are we supposed to trust our lives to someone who treats military aircraft like their pets? The other officers had laughed, but there was an edge to their humor. Sarah's success rate was undeniable. She had completed more successful missions than any other pilot in her squadron, and her aircraft always seemed to perform better than expected. The criticism had intensified after what became known as the Cologne incident. During a bombing run over the German city, Sarah's formation had encountered unexpected heavy flak. Standard procedure called for maintaining formation and pushing through. But Sarah had sensed something wrong with her aircraft before her instruments even registered the problem. She had broken formation, performed what looked like a completely reckless series of maneuvers, and somehow managed to avoid the worst of the anti-aircraft fire while still delivering her payload on target. Her commanding officers had been furious. "Mitchell, you endangered the entire formation with that stunt," Colonel Harrison had shouted during the debriefing. "We have procedures for a reason. You can't just improvise in the middle of combat operations." But Sarah had stood her ground, explaining that she had felt the aircraft telling her something was wrong, that staying in formation would have been suicide. The other pilots had exchanged glances. There she went again, talking about the aircraft as if it were alive. The tension had only grown worse when the post-mission inspection revealed that Sarah's aircraft had indeed suffered significant damage that hadn't been immediately apparent. A piece of flak had damaged her hydraulic system in a way that would have caused catastrophic failure if she had continued flying in the standard formation pattern. Her reckless maneuvers had actually been precisely what was needed to keep the aircraft flying safely. But instead of vindication, Sarah had received only grudging acknowledgement and more whispers about her weird flying style. The other pilots had given her nicknames: the Whisperer, Plain Witch, and less flattering variations. They respected her results, but they couldn't understand her methods. In their minds, flying was about following procedures, trusting instruments, and maintaining discipline. Sarah's approach seemed to throw all of that out the window in favor of some mystical connection that made them deeply uncomfortable. "She's going to get herself killed," Lieutenant Tommy Rodriguez had predicted after the Cologne mission. "And probably take a whole crew with her. You can't fly by feelings in combat. The Germans don't care about your intuition, they care about shooting you down." His words had echoed the sentiment of many in the squadron, but Sarah had continued to fly her own way, racking up successful missions while her critics watched and waited for her inevitable failure. What they didn't understand was that Sarah's approach wasn't mystical at all. It was based on an incredibly deep understanding of aircraft mechanics, aerodynamics, and the subtle cues that every plane gives its pilot. She had spent countless hours studying every system, every component, every possible failure mode. When she placed her hands on the fuselage, she wasn't communing with spirits, she was feeling for vibrations, temperature variations, and structural anomalies that might indicate problems. When she listened to the aircraft, she was actually processing dozens of subtle audio cues that trained mechanics would recognize, but that most pilots had never learned to interpret. But explaining this to her fellow pilots was impossible. They saw her success and assumed it was luck, or worse, some kind of feminine intuition that had no place in military aviation. The fact that she was a woman made everything worse. Every unconventional decision was seen as evidence that women weren't suited for combat flying, rather than recognition of exceptional skill. As Sarah approached her aircraft that March morning, she could feel the familiar weight of skepticism and barely concealed hostility from her fellow pilots. Today's mission would be different, though. Today, all of her unconventional skills, all of her intuitive understanding of aircraft, all of the techniques that had made her the subject of mockery and criticism would be put to the ultimate test. Briefing room at RAF Greenham Common was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as the mission details were laid out for the assembled aircrew. Major William Bull Thompson, the squadron's operations officer, stood before a large map of occupied Europe, his pointer tracing the route that would take them deep into German territory. The target was the Messerschmitt production facility at Regensburg, a heavily defended industrial complex that had been churning out fighter aircraft for the Luftwaffe at an alarming rate. "Gentlemen," Major Thompson began, his eyes deliberately avoiding Sarah as she sat among the other pilots. "And lady," he added with barely concealed reluctance, "this is going to be a tough one. Intelligence reports indicate that the Germans have significantly increased their anti-aircraft defenses around Regensburg following our previous raids. We're talking about at least 40 heavy flak guns, plus fighter patrols that will likely intercept us before we reach the target." Sarah studied the mission parameters with the same intensity as her male colleagues, but she was also processing information that wasn't on the official briefing charts. The weather report mentioned scattered cloud cover at 15,000 feet, which could provide concealment, but also create turbulence that might affect bombing accuracy. The timing of the mission meant they would be flying during a period when German fighter squadrons typically rotated their patrols, potentially creating a narrow window of reduced air-to-air opposition. The formation will consist of 12 B-17s. Major Thompson continued, flying in standard box formation. Captain Mitchell will be flying as deputy lead in Liberty Bell, with Lieutenant Rodriguez as her co-pilot. The announcement caused a stir among the assembled crew members. It was unusual for a WASP pilot to be given such a prominent position in a major bombing operation, and the fact that she would be flying with Rodriguez, one of her harshest critics, added another layer of complexity to an already dangerous mission. After the briefing, Sarah made her way to the flight line for her pre-mission inspection of Liberty Bell. The B-17 was a veteran aircraft, having completed over 30 combat missions, and she showed her age in the patches on her aluminum skin and the faded paint on her nose art. But as Sarah approached the aircraft, she could sense something that the maintenance reports hadn't. Captured a subtle vibration in the left wing that suggested a potential problem with the number 2 engine mount. She climbed up onto the wing and examined the engine cowling carefully, running her hands along the mounting points and listening to the subtle sounds that the aircraft made as it settled on its landing gear. There a barely perceptible looseness in one of the mounting bolts that could become a serious problem under the stress of combat maneuvering. She flagged the issue for the ground crew, who tightened the bolt and shook their heads in amazement. "How did you spot that, Captain?" Sergeant Mike O'Brien, the crew chief, asked with genuine curiosity. "My guys did a complete inspection yesterday and didn't find anything wrong with that mount." Sarah smiled. "The aircraft tells you things if you know how to listen. That bolt was maybe a quarter turn loose, not enough to show up on a visual inspection, but enough to create a resonance that would have gotten worse once we were in the air." Sergeant O'Brien nodded, making a note in his maintenance log. Unlike the pilots, the ground crew had learned to respect Sarah's uncanny ability to detect problems before they became critical. As the crews prepared for takeoff, Sarah noticed Lieutenant Rodriguez approaching with his usual expression of barely concealed skepticism. "Captain," he said, the rank title carrying just a hint of sarcasm, "I hope you're not planning any of your famous interpretive flying on this mission. This is a serious operation, and we need to stick to standard procedures." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Lieutenant, I've never lost a crew member or failed to complete a mission. My methods might be different, but my results speak for themselves. Today, I need you to trust me and follow my lead, regardless of whether you understand what I'm doing or why I'm doing it." Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "It's not about trust, Captain. It's about discipline and following established procedures. When you start freelancing up there, you put everyone at risk." "And when you ignore what the aircraft is telling you," Sarah replied, "you put everyone at even greater risk. The Germans don't care about our procedures, Tommy. They care about shooting us down, and sometimes staying alive means thinking outside the box." She turned and walked toward the aircraft, leaving Rodriguez to follow with obvious reluctance. The takeoff sequence proceeded normally, with the 12 B-17s lifting off from the English countryside and forming up over the North Sea. Sarah's position as deputy lead put her in the number 2 slot, flying slightly behind and to the right of the formation leader, Colonel Harrison's aircraft, Memphis Belle II. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was flying in a position where she could observe and potentially take over if something happened to the lead aircraft, but where she was also under constant scrutiny from the formation commander who had been one of her harshest critics. As they crossed the English Channel and entered occupied airspace, Sarah began to notice subtle changes in the behavior of her aircraft that weren't registering on the standard instruments. The engine synchronization was slightly off, creating a harmonic vibration that suggested one of the engines was working harder than the others. The control surfaces felt slightly sluggish, indicating that the aircraft might be carrying more weight than the loading manifest suggested, or that there was ice beginning to form despite the relatively warm temperature. "Rodriguez," she called over the intercom, "check the engine RPM settings. Number 3 is running about 50 RPM faster than the others." Rodriguez glanced at his instruments. "Everything looks normal to me, Captain. All engines are running within spec." Sarah made a subtle adjustment to the throttle settings, bringing the engines into better synchronization. The vibration smoothed out immediately, and the aircraft seemed to settle into a more comfortable cruise attitude. "Better?" she asked. Rodriguez had to admit that the aircraft did seem to be flying more smoothly. "Yeah, I can feel the difference. How did you know to do that?" "The aircraft was telling me," Sarah replied, knowing how that would sound to her. Skeptical co-pilot. When you've been flying as long as I have, you learn to recognize the subtle signs that something isn't quite right. even when the instruments say everything is normal. As they approached the German border, Sarah's attention became focused on a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the obvious dangers of the mission ahead. Something was wrong not with her aircraft, but with the entire formation. The spacing between aircraft was slightly irregular, the timing of radio transmissions was off, and there were subtle changes in the behavior of the other pilots that suggested they were more nervous than usual. What Sarah couldn't have known was that German radar operators had been tracking their formation since they crossed the English Channel, and that Luftwaffe fighters were already climbing to intercept them. The trap that awaited them over occupied Europe would test every skill she had learned and force her to make decisions that would either vindicate her unconventional methods or prove her critics right in the most deadly way possible. The transition from the relative safety of Allied airspace to the deadly skies over occupied Europe was always marked by a palpable change in tension. But today Sarah sensed something different. As the formation of B-17s crossed into German territory, she noticed that the radio chatter had become more clipped and nervous than usual. Even Colonel Harrison's typically steady voice carried an edge of uncertainty that set her own instincts. "On high alert. Bandits, 2 o'clock high." The warning crackled over the radio from the tail gunner of the lead aircraft. Sarah immediately scanned the sky in the indicated direction and spotted them. A flight of 6 Messerschmitt Bf 109s climbing rapidly to intercept the formation. This was earlier than expected. Intelligence had suggested that German fighter patrols in this sector typically didn't engage Allied bombers until they were much closer to the target. "All aircraft maintain formation," Colonel Harrison ordered over the radio. "Gunners, prepare for engagement. Do not break formation unless specifically ordered." Sarah felt her aircraft shudder slightly as the gunners in Liberty Bell test-fired their weapons, and she made minute adjustments to her controls to compensate for the shift in weight distribution. But her attention was focused on something else. The way the German fighters were approaching didn't match their usual tactics. Instead of the coordinated head-on attacks that had become standard Luftwaffe procedure, these fighters seemed to be setting up for a different kind of engagement. "Something's not right," she muttered, more to herself than to Rodriguez. "What do you mean?" her co-pilot asked, his eyes fixed on the approaching German aircraft. "Their approach vector is all wrong," Sarah replied, her hands making subtle adjustments to the aircraft's trim as she prepared for evasive action. "They're not setting up for a standard attack pattern. It's like they're trying to hurt us toward something." Rodriguez glanced at her skeptically. "Captain, with respect, you're reading too much into it. They're just German fighters doing what German fighters do, trying to shoot us down." But Sarah's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The German pilots were flying with a level of coordination that suggested they were following a specific plan, not simply engaging targets of opportunity. More importantly, they were approaching from an angle that would force the Allied formation to turn slightly to the north if they wanted to maintain their defensive positioning, exactly the kind of subtle course change that could set them up for a trap. "Liberty Bell to formation leader," Sarah called over the radio. "Request permission to adjust course to avoid." "Negative, Liberty Bell." Colonel Harrison's voice cut her off. "Maintain current heading and formation. Do not break radio discipline." Sarah bit back her frustration. The standard procedure was to maintain formation discipline at all costs, but her instincts were telling her that following standard procedure was exactly what the Germans were counting on. She could feel the aircraft responding to her subtle inputs, and she began to prepare for the possibility that she might need to take immediate, evasive action regardless of orders. The German fighters were closing rapidly now, and Sarah could see the muzzle flashes as they opened fire. The defensive fire from the bomber formation lit up the sky, and she felt Liberty Bell buck and shudder as her gunners engaged the attacking aircraft. But instead of the sustained attack she had expected, the German fighters made only a brief Pass before pulling away, exactly the kind of diversionary tactic that suggested they were setting up for something else. All aircraft maintain formation, Colonel Harrison ordered again, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The German attack had been too brief, too coordinated, and too successful at pushing the formation slightly off course. That's when Sarah saw them, a second group of German fighters, larger than the first, approaching from the southwest at an angle that would put them directly in the path of the bomber formation's adjusted course. The first attack had been a feint, designed to push the Allied aircraft into a killing zone, where they could be attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. "Formation leader, this is Liberty Bell," Sarah called urgently. "We have additional bandits approaching from the southwest. I count at least 12 aircraft setting up for a coordinated attack." "Confirmed, Liberty Bell," came the reply from one of the other aircraft. "I see them too. They're moving to cut off our escape route." "Colonel." Harrison's voice was tight with tension as he responded. "All aircraft, prepare for evasive action. Gunners, engage targets as they come into range. Do not break formation unless..." The radio transmission was cut off as the second wave of German fighters opened fire. This time, the attack was sustained and coordinated, with multiple aircraft attacking from different angles simultaneously. Sarah watched in horror as the B-17 flying to her left, Georgia Peach, took a direct hit in the number 2 engine. The engine exploded in a ball of fire, and the aircraft immediately began to lose altitude. "Georgia Peach is going down," Rodriguez shouted over the intercom. "They're losing altitude fast." Sarah's hands moved instinctively on the controls, making the subtle adjustments that kept Liberty Bell in formation while simultaneously preparing for the evasive maneuvers that she knew would be necessary. The aircraft was responding well, but she could feel the stress of combat maneuvering beginning to take its toll on the airframe. "All aircraft, this is Formation Leader, Colonel Harrison's voice crackled over the radio. "We're taking heavy casualties. Prepare to abort the mission and return to base." But Sarah knew that turning back now would be suicide. The German fighters had positioned themselves to cut off the retreat route, and the damaged aircraft in the formation wouldn't be able to maintain the speed necessary to outrun the pursuit. They were in a trap, and following standard procedure would get them all killed. "Liberty Bell to Formation Leader," Sarah called over the radio. "Request permission to take evasive action. I can see a way through the fighter screen, but we need to break formation now." "Negative, Liberty Bell," Harrison replied. "Maintain formation and follow my lead." Sarah watched as Harrison's aircraft began a standard evasive turn that would take the formation directly into the path of the waiting German fighters. In that moment, she made a decision that would define the rest of her career and possibly the rest of her life. She was going to break formation and follow her instincts, regardless of the consequences. "Tommy," she said to Rodriguez, "hold on tight. We're going off the reservation." The German fighters that Sarah had sensed were approaching, materialized out of the morning sky like deadly angels, their formation precise and their intent unmistakable. What happened next would either validate years of criticism about her flying methods, or prove that sometimes survival required abandoning everything the textbooks taught about military discipline. The moment Sarah pushed the control yoke forward and broke from formation, she felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft responding to her touch like a living thing. Liberty Bell dropped below the formation, just as a burst of cannon fire ripped through the space where they had been flying moments before. Rodriguez let out a string of expletives that would have made a sailor blush, but Sarah was already deep in the zone where conscious thought gave way to pure instinct. "What the hell are you doing, Mitchell?" Colonel Harrison's voice exploded over the radio. "Get back in formation immediately." Sarah ignored the radio chatter and focused on the deadly ballet unfolding around them. She could see the German fighters repositioning themselves, trying to adapt to her unexpected maneuver. But she had already anticipated their response, and Liberty Bell was climbing at an angle that would take them through a gap in the enemy formation that wouldn't exist for more than a few seconds. "Captain, we need to get back with the formation," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with fear and anger. "You're going to get us all killed." "No," Sarah replied, her voice calm despite the chaos around them. "Following Harrison is what's going to get us killed. Look at the fighter positions. They're set up to funnel us into a killing zone. The only way through is to go where they don't expect us to go." As if to prove her point, she watched Harrison's aircraft take a direct hit from a German fighter that had been waiting exactly where standard evasive procedures would have taken them. The B-17's right wing exploded in a shower of debris, and the aircraft began a sickening spiral toward the ground. Sarah felt a moment of grief for the colonel and his crew, but she couldn't afford to dwell on it. She had her own crew to save. "All aircraft, this is Liberty Bell," Sarah called over the radio. "The formation leader is down. I'm taking command. Follow my lead if you want to live." The response was immediate and chaotic. Some pilots acknowledged her transmission. Others demanded to know by what authority she was assuming command, and a few simply ignored her completely. But Sarah was already moving, taking Liberty Bell through a series of maneuvers that defied conventional wisdom, but somehow kept them alive. She rolled the aircraft inverted and pulled into a steep dive, using the bomber's weight and momentum to build speed that would carry them through the German fighter screen. It was a maneuver that shouldn't have worked. B-17s weren't designed for aerobatic flight, and the stress on the airframe should have been catastrophic. But Sarah had calculated the aircraft's limits with a precision that came from years of feeling every rivet and joint respond to her commands. "Jesus Christ, Captain!" Rodriguez shouted as they pulled out of the dive with G-forces that pressed them deep into their seats. "You're going to tear the wings off." But the wings held, and Liberty Bell shot through the gap in the German formation like a bolt of lightning. Sarah immediately began climbing again, using the aircraft's momentum to gain altitude and put distance between them and the fighters. Behind them, she could see 3 other B-17s following her lead, while the remainder of the formation was being systematically destroyed by the German trap. "This is Yankee Doodle," came a voice over the radio. "We're with you, Liberty Bell. What's the plan?" Sarah glanced at her navigation instruments and made a rapid calculation. They were too far from the target to complete the original mission, but they were also too far from home to make it back with the fuel they had remaining. There was, however, a third option, one that would require her to trust her instincts completely and ask her crew to follow her into what looked like certain death. "We're going to complete the mission," she announced over the radio, "but we're going to do it my way." The protests came immediately. "Captain, we don't have enough aircraft left to effectively attack the target," came the voice from Yankee Doodle. "And we've lost our fighter escort. This is suicide." "No," Sarah replied, her mind already working through the tactical problem. "This is an opportunity. The Germans just threw everything they had at us because they thought we were following standard procedure. They won't expect us to press the attack with a reduced force, and they won't expect us to come from the direction we're now positioned to attack from." She was right, but proving it would require her to do something that had never been attempted in combat, use a heavy bomber like a fighter, employing tactics that were completely outside the aircraft's design parameters. The B-17 was built to fly straight and level, absorbing punishment while delivering bombs on target. It was not built for the kind of low-level, high-speed attack that Sarah was planning. "All aircraft following Liberty Bell," she called over the radio. "We're going to drop to treetop level and approach the target from the northeast. The Germans won't expect an attack from that direction and will be below their radar coverage until we're too close for them to mount an effective defense." The plan was audacious to the point of insanity. Flying a formation of heavy bombers at low altitude through hostile territory was asking for trouble from every Anti-aircraft gun in the area. But Sarah had noticed something during the initial attack that the others had missed. The German fighters had been recalled to defend against the main formation, leaving the target area temporarily vulnerable. "Captain," Rodriguez said, his voice calmer now, "I don't understand half of what you're doing, but I can see that it's working. What do you need from me?" Sarah felt a moment of gratitude for her co-pilot's trust. "I need you to monitor the engines closely. We're going to be asking a lot of this aircraft over the next 30 minutes, and I need to know the instant anything starts to go wrong." As they dropped to low altitude, Sarah felt Liberty Bell respond to the denser air with a subtle change in handling characteristics. The aircraft felt more solid, more responsive, but also more vulnerable to ground fire. She would have to rely on speed and surprise to get them through the heavily defended areas between their current position and the target. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The landscape below them was a patchwork of fields and forests, dotted with small towns and military installations. Sarah navigated by landmarks, using her intimate knowledge of European geography to find a route that would minimize their exposure to known defensive positions. It was a skill that couldn't be taught in flight school. It required an intuitive understanding of terrain, weather, and enemy tactics that came only from experience. "Target in sight," came the call from the bombardier, beginning bomb run approach. Sarah felt the aircraft respond as the bomb bay doors opened, changing the aerodynamic characteristics in subtle ways that required immediate compensation. But she was ready for it, her hands moving instinctively to keep the aircraft stable as they approached the target. The Messerschmitt factory was spread out below them, its buildings and runways clearly visible in the morning light. Sarah could see workers running for cover as the sound of approaching aircraft reached them. But she could also see something else, anti-aircraft guns swiveling to track their approach, and the telltale signs of fighter aircraft scrambling to intercept them. "Bomb bay doors open," the bombardier called. "Approaching release point." Sarah held the aircraft steady despite the increasing ground fire. Flak bursts were appearing all around them, and she could feel the aircraft shudder as fragments struck the fuselage. But Liberty Bell held together, and Sarah's steady hand kept them on target, bombs away. The aircraft lurched upward as the bombs fell away, and Sarah immediately began evasive maneuvers to avoid the worst of the anti-aircraft fire. Behind them, she could see the explosions as their bombs found their targets, sending pillars of smoke and flame into the sky. But their troubles were far from over. The German fighters were closing fast, and Liberty Bell was damaged and low on fuel. Sarah would need every bit of her skill and intuition to get her crew home alive. The real test of her abilities was just beginning, and the next few hours would determine whether her unconventional methods could overcome the mounting odds against their survival. As the smoke from the bombed Messerschmitt factory faded behind them, Sarah Mitchell faced a sobering reality. Getting to the target had been the easy part. Now flying a badly damaged aircraft through hundreds of miles of hostile territory, she would discover whether her intuitive understanding of aviation could overcome mechanical failure, fuel shortage, and the relentless pursuit of German fighters. Return flight from the target should have taken 2 hours. It took almost 4. And every minute of it was a testament to Sarah's ability to coax performance from a badly damaged aircraft that had no business still being in the air. The successful bombing of the Messerschmitt factory had come at a cost. Liberty Bell had taken multiple hits from anti-aircraft fire, and the damage was becoming more apparent with each passing mile. "Captain, we're losing hydraulic pressure," Rodriguez reported, his voice tight with concern. "The landing gear system is showing red, and the flaps are only partially responsive." Sarah felt the aircraft's changed handling characteristics before. The instruments confirmed what Rodriguez was telling her. The control surfaces were becoming sluggish, requiring more force to achieve the same response. More critically, she could feel a vibration in the airframe that suggested structural damage, possibly to the wing spars or control cables. "What's our fuel situation?" she asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "We're below half tanks," Rodriguez replied after checking the gauges. "At current consumption, we've got maybe 90 minutes of flight time left." Sarah did the math quickly. They were still over occupied territory, at least 2 hours from the English coast at their current speed. The aircraft was too damaged to risk climbing to a more fuel-efficient altitude, and the pursuing German fighters meant that they couldn't afford to reduce power. They were in a race against time, fuel, and mechanical failure, and they were losing on all 3 fronts. "Liberty Bell to remaining aircraft," Sarah called over the radio. "What's your status?" The responses weren't encouraging. Of the 4 aircraft that had followed her away from the original formation, only 2 were still airborne. Yankee Doodle had taken engine damage and was trailing smoke, while Prairie Rose was reporting electrical failures that had knocked out half her instruments. The 3rd aircraft, Mississippi Queen, had been shot down during the escape from the target area. "We need to help each other get home," Sarah announced. "Yankee Doodle, can you maintain altitude?" "Negative, Liberty Bell," came the reply. "We're losing about 200 feet per minute. I don't think we're going to make it to the channel." Sarah made a decision that would have been unthinkable to most pilots. Instead of leaving the damaged aircraft behind to increase her own chances of survival, she reduced power and dropped to the same altitude as Yankee Doodle. The maneuver cost her precious fuel and put her own aircraft at greater risk, but it also allowed her to provide protection for the damaged bomber. "What are you doing, Captain?" Rodriguez asked. "We can't afford to slow down. We're already cutting it too close on fuel." "We don't leave anyone behind," Sarah replied. "Besides, there's a better chance of all of us making it home if we work together. Single aircraft are easy targets for fighters, but a small formation can still provide mutual support." It was a decision that epitomized Sarah's approach to flying: intuitive, unconventional, and based on considerations that went beyond simple mathematical calculations. She had sensed that the German fighters were still hunting for stragglers, and that their best chance of survival lay in mutual support rather than individual escape attempts. Her instincts proved correct 20 minutes later when a pair of Focke-Wulf 190s appeared behind them, closing rapidly for an attack. The fighters had probably been hoping to find isolated, damaged bombers that would be easy prey. Instead, they found a coordinated formation that was ready for them. "Fighters coming in from 6 o'clock, Sarah called over the radio. "All gunners, prepare to engage." The ensuing air battle was brief but intense. The German fighters made repeated passes at the formation, but the coordinated defensive fire from the 3 bombers made their attacks costly. Sarah used every trick she had learned to keep Liberty Bell in position to provide maximum defensive coverage while simultaneously protecting the more vulnerable Yankee Doodle. During one particularly close pass, Sarah felt her aircraft shudder as cannon shells walked across the right wing. For a moment, she thought they might lose the wing entirely, but Liberty Bell held together. The German fighters, having taken damage of their own, broke off the attack and disappeared into the clouds. "Nice shooting, boys," Sarah called over the intercom to her gunners. "But we're not out of the woods yet. Rodriguez, how are those engines looking?" "Number 3 is running rough," Rodriguez replied. "Temperature's climbing, and we're losing oil pressure. I don't think it's going to last much longer." As if summoned by his words, the number 3 engine began to emit a trail of black smoke. Sarah immediately began the shutdown procedure, feathering the propeller and cutting fuel flow to the damaged engine. The aircraft's performance degraded noticeably, and she had to make constant adjustments to maintain level flight. "Can we make it on 3 engines?" Rodriguez asked. Sarah was all ready. calculating the revised flight parameters. With one engine shut down, their fuel consumption would actually improve, but their speed would decrease significantly. More critically, the asymmetric thrust would make the aircraft much more difficult to control, especially during landing. "We'll make it," she said, projecting more confidence than she felt. "But it's going to be close." The English Channel appeared ahead of them like a gray ribbon separating occupied Europe from safety. Sarah felt a surge of relief as they crossed the coastline, but she knew their troubles were far from over. The damaged aircraft would need to make an emergency landing, and with only 3 engines and compromised hydraulics, that landing would be extremely challenging. "Liberty Bell to RAF Greenham Common," Sarah called over the radio. "We're coming in with battle damage. Request priority landing and emergency equipment standing by." The response was immediate. "Liberty Bell, this is Greenham Common Control. We have you on radar. What's your condition?" "One engine shut down, hydraulic system compromised, structural damage unknown," Sarah replied. "We're going to need the longest runway you've got, and we're going to need it cleared of all other traffic." As they approached the airfield, Sarah could see the emergency vehicles already in position along the runway. The sight should have been comforting, but instead it reminded her of just how dangerous the next few minutes were going to be. Landing a damaged bomber was always risky, but landing one without full hydraulic power was a challenge that would test every skill she had learned. "Rodriguez," she said, "I want you to take over the radio calls. I'm going to need all my attention." Focused on flying this aircraft, her co-pilot nodded grimly. "Whatever you need, Captain. We're all counting on you." As they began their approach to the runway, Sarah felt Liberty Bell respond to her touch with the sluggish, unpredictable handling that characterized a badly damaged aircraft. Every control input had to be anticipated and compensated for, and she found herself flying more by feel than by sight as the aircraft fought her attempts to maintain a stable approach. The next few minutes would determine whether all her years of unconventional flying had prepared her for this ultimate test. The tower's emergency lights painted the runway in an eerie red glow as Sarah lined up Liberty Bell for what every pilot on the ground believed would be a catastrophic crash. But Sarah had spent her entire career proving that impossible situations simply required impossible solutions. The final approach to RAF Greenham Common should have been routine as standard, landing after a successful mission. Instead, it became the most challenging flying Sarah had ever attempted. Liberty Bell was responding to her controls like a wounded animal, unpredictable and dangerous, requiring constant correction to maintain even the semblance of a stable approach. "Airspeed is fluctuating," Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with tension. "We're getting inconsistent readings from the pitot system." Sarah nodded grimly. She had already noticed that the aircraft's indicated airspeed was unreliable, probably due to battle damage to the airspeed sensing system. She was flying by feel now, using the sound of the wind over the aircraft and the response of the controls to judge their speed and attitude. It was a skill that couldn't be taught in flight school. It required an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics that came only from years of experience. "Gear down," she called, and Rodriguez reached for the landing gear lever. The hydraulic system groaned and protested, but slowly the gear extended. However, the indicator lights showed that the gear was not fully locked in position. "Gear shows unsafe," Rodriguez reported. "We've got 3 green lights, but they're flickering. I'm not sure the gear is fully extended." Sarah felt the aircraft's handling change as the partially extended gear created additional drag and altered the aerodynamic characteristics. The aircraft wanted to pitch nose down, and she had to apply constant back pressure on the controls to maintain the proper approach attitude. Her arms were already aching from the effort of controlling the damaged aircraft, and they still had several minutes of flying before they reached the runway. "Flaps, She asked, though she already suspected what the answer would be. Rodriguez tried the flap controls, but nothing happened. Flaps are not responding. The hydraulic system doesn't have enough pressure to extend them. Landing without flaps would mean a much higher approach speed and a longer landing roll, with questionable landing gear and limited braking capability. It would be a challenge even for an undamaged aircraft. For Liberty Bell, it might be impossible. What's the wind situation? Sarah asked. Control tower reports winds from the west at 15 knots, gusting to 25, Rodriguez replied. They're offering us any runway we want. Sarah quickly calculated the options. The main runway ran east-west, which would mean landing with a quartering headwind, not ideal, but manageable. The longer north-south runway would mean a crosswind landing, which would be extremely dangerous given the aircraft's condition. But the north-south runway was also longer, which would give them more room to stop if the brakes failed. Tell the tower we'll take runway 09, she decided, and ask them to have the crash trucks follow us down the runway. As they turned onto final approach, Sarah could see the emergency vehicles positioning themselves along the runway. The sight should have been reassuring, but instead it drove home the reality of their situation. If this landing went wrong, there would be very little that the crash crews could do to help them. 2 miles out, Rodriguez called. Airspeed. Well, it's somewhere between 130 and 150. I can't get a consistent reading. Sarah was flying by the seat of her pants now, literally feeling her way through the approach. The aircraft was wallowing in the air, responding slowly to control inputs and requiring constant correction to maintain heading and altitude. She could feel the asymmetric thrust from the 3 remaining engines trying to pull the aircraft to the right, and she was applying constant left rudder pressure to keep them aligned with the runway. 1 mile out, Rodriguez called. We're looking good, Captain. Just keep her steady. But Sarah could feel that something was wrong. The aircraft was responding differently than she expected, and there was a vibration in the controls that suggested structural damage more severe than they had realized. She was asking Liberty Bell to do something that the aircraft might not be capable of, making a controlled landing despite damage that would normally require the crew to abandon the aircraft. Tower, this is Liberty Bell, Rodriguez called. Over the radio, we're committed to landing. If we don't make it, tell everyone that Captain Mitchell is the best pilot I've ever flown with. Sarah didn't have time to appreciate the compliment. The runway was rushing up at them, and she could see that their approach angle was too steep. The aircraft was descending faster than she wanted, but she didn't have the power available to arrest the descent without risking the stall. She would have to use every bit of skill she possessed to pull off a landing that was becoming more impossible by the second. 50 feet, Rodriguez called. 40.30.20. Sarah pulled back on the controls, trying to flare the aircraft for landing. But Liberty Bell was too heavy, too damaged, and too fast. They hit the runway hard, bouncing back into the air before slamming down again. The landing gear held, but Sarah could hear the grinding of metal on metal as the aircraft settled onto the runway. Brakes, she called, and Rodriguez applied the wheel brakes. But the response was sluggish, and they were still traveling at high speed down the runway. The end of the runway was approaching fast, and beyond it lay a fence, a road, and a small village. Sarah made one final decision that would either save them or kill them all. She deliberately ground-looped the aircraft, using the damaged landing gear and the aircraft's own weight to scrub off speed in a controlled crash. It was a maneuver that would destroy the aircraft, but it would also bring them to a stop before they ran out of runway. Liberty Bell slewed sideways, the landing gear collapsing as the aircraft spun around its own axis. Metal screamed against concrete, and Sarah felt the aircraft disintegrating around her as they finally came to rest in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, there was silence. Then Rodriguez's voice, shaky but triumphant. "We're down, Captain. We're alive and we're down." Sarah looked around at her crew, all of whom were staring at her with expressions of amazement and gratitude. She had done the impossible, brought home an aircraft that should have been lost over Germany, saving the lives of 9 men in the process. And she had done it using the same unconventional flying techniques that had made her the subject of mockery and criticism. But as the emergency crew surrounded the wreckage and her crew was helped to safety, Sarah knew that the real battle was just beginning. She had survived the mission, but now she would have to survive the inevitable investigation and court-martial. That would determine whether her actions had been heroic or simply insubordinate. The court-martial that Sarah had expected never came. Instead, 12 hours after her emergency landing, she found herself standing in General Crawford's office, not as a defendant, but as the subject of the most intensive tactical debriefing in the squadron's history. The impossible had become merely improbable, and military minds were struggling to understand how. The silence that followed the crash landing of Liberty Bell was broken only by the sound of approaching sirens and the hiss of steam escaping from the aircraft's damaged cooling systems. Sarah remained in her pilot's seat for a moment, her hands still gripping the controls, her mind slowly processing the fact that they had survived what should have been an impossible landing. "Everybody out," she called over the intercom. "Emergency evacuation procedures. I want everyone off this aircraft in 60 seconds. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, despite their shock and exhaustion. The waist gunners kicked out the escape hatches, and the men began dropping through the openings onto the concrete runway below. Sarah performed a quick scan of the cockpit, ensuring that the engines were shut down and the fuel systems were secured, before following Rodriguez through the forward escape hatch. As her feet touched the ground, Sarah felt her legs buckle slightly. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the mission and the harrowing landing was beginning to wear off, leaving her drained and shaky. But she forced herself to remain upright and alert. Her responsibilities as aircraft commander didn't end just because they were back on the ground. "Sound off," she called to her crew. "I want to hear from everyone." One by one, the crew members called out their names and condition. Miraculously, despite the violent landing and the battle damage sustained during the mission, none of the crew had been seriously injured. The tail gunner, Sergeant Bill Murphy, had a gash on his forehead from a piece of flying debris, and the radio operator, Corporal Jake Hansen, was nursing a sprained wrist, but everyone was alive and able to walk away. From the wreckage, the emergency crews arrived within minutes, surrounding the crashed aircraft with foam and water to prevent fire. The crash trucks were followed by a convoy of staff cars, carrying senior officers who had heard about the emergency landing on the radio. Sarah recognized several faces among the arriving officials, including some who had been among her harshest critics. Captain Mitchell. The voice belonged to Major General Robert Crawford, the base commander, who strode across the tarmac with an expression that Sarah couldn't read. What in the hell happened out there? Sarah drew herself to attention, despite her exhaustion. "Sir, we encountered heavy enemy resistance during the mission. The formation was broken up by a coordinated German attack, and we had to adapt our tactics to complete the mission and return home." "Adapt your tactics?" General Crawford's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Captain, I've been listening to the Kendley radio traffic from this mission. You broke formation without orders, assumed command without authorization, and conducted an unauthorized bombing attack with insufficient forces. Do you have any idea what kind of position you've put me in?" Sarah felt the familiar weight of criticism settling on her shoulders. Even after successfully completing the mission and bringing her crew home alive, she was being questioned and criticized for her unconventional methods. But before she could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "General, with respect, Captain Mitchell just saved my life and the lives of my crew." It was Rodriguez stepping forward despite his obvious exhaustion. When our formation leader was shot down, Captain Mitchell took command and got us through a German fighter screen that should have killed us all. She completed the mission when anyone else would have turned back, and she brought us home when our aircraft was too damaged to fly." "That's right, sir," added Sergeant Murphy, the tail gunner. "Captain Mitchell is the reason we're all standing here instead of being prisoners of war or worse. She flew that aircraft like it was a part of her own body, making it do things that I didn't think were possible." General Crawford looked around at the assembled crew members, all of whom were nodding in agreement with Rodriguez's assessment. He then turned his attention to the wreckage of Liberty Bell, taking in the extensive battle damage and the evidence of the violent landing. The fact that anyone had survived in that aircraft was remarkable. The fact that they had completed their mission first was almost unbelievable. "How many aircraft made it back?" the general asked, his tone becoming more subdued. "3 out of 12, sir," Sarah replied. "We lost Colonel Harrison and 8 other crews during the initial attack. The remaining aircraft were too damaged to continue the mission." The general was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Sarah had told him. The loss of 9 bombers and their crews was a significant blow to the squadron, but it could have been much worse. If Sarah hadn't taken command when she did, it was likely that none of the aircraft would have returned. "The target?" he asked, destroyed. "Sir," replied, "we achieved complete surprise on the bombing run. The Messerschmitt factory took direct hits to the main production buildings and the assembly hangars. Intelligence will have to confirm the damage, but based on what we saw, I estimate that production will be shut down for at least 6 months." General Crawford nodded slowly. The mission had been a success, despite the heavy losses. More importantly, it had been a success because of Sarah's unconventional leadership and flying skills, not in spite of them. The same qualities that had made her a target for criticism had ultimately saved the mission and the lives of her crew. "Captain Mitchell," the general said finally, "I want a full debriefing in my office at 0800 tomorrow. I want to know everything about this mission, every decision you made, every tactic you employed, and every factor that contributed to your success. If we're going to continue flying missions like this, we need to understand what you did and why it worked." Sarah felt a surge of hope. For the first time since joining the squadron, it seemed like her superiors were actually interested in learning from her methods rather than simply criticizing them. "Yes, sir, I'll have a complete report ready for you." As the general walked away, Sarah turned her attention back to her crew. They were being checked over by the medical personnel, and she could see the relief in their faces as they realized that they were truly safe. But she could also see something else, a new respect for her leadership and her flying, skills that hadn't been there before the mission. "Captain," Rodriguez said, approaching her as the medical team finished checking him over, "I owe you an apology. I thought your flying style was reckless and dangerous. I was wrong. You didn't just save our lives today, you did something that I didn't think was possible. You turned a disaster into a victory." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "Tommy, you don't owe me an apology. You did your job up there, and you trusted me when it mattered most. That's all any pilot can ask for from their crew." As she looked around at the crash site, Sarah realized that everything had changed. The aircraft that had carried them home was destroyed, but the mission had been successful. More importantly, she had proven that her unconventional methods weren't just effective, they were sometimes the only thing that stood between survival and disaster. But the real test was still to come. The success of one mission wouldn't be enough to change the attitudes of her fellow pilots or her superiors. She would need to prove herself again and again, demonstrating that her methods were reliable and repeatable. The war was far from over, and there would be many more missions where unconventional thinking would be the difference between life and death. The debriefing session in General Crawford's office the next morning was unlike any military meeting Sarah had ever attended. Instead of the usual formal interrogation about procedure violations and unauthorized actions, she found herself in the middle of an intensive tactical discussion that included not only the general but also the squadron's intelligence officer, the operations officer, and several experienced pilots who had been called in to analyze her mission. "Captain Mitchell," General Crawford began, gesturing to a large map of the mission area that had been set up on one wall. "I want you to walk us through every decision you made from the moment you broke formation until you landed that aircraft. I want to understand not just what you did, but why you did it and how you knew it would work." Sarah stood before the map, pointing to the various waypoints and tactical positions as she explained her reasoning. "When I saw the German fighters approaching from two different directions, I recognized it as a coordinated attack designed to funnel our formation into a predetermined kill zone. The standard response would have been to maintain formation discipline and try to fight through the attack, but that would have played directly into their hands. So you decided to break formation, Major Thompson," the operations officer interjected. "That's a direct violation of standing orders. What gave you the authority to make that decision?" Sarah looked him directly in the eye. "Sir, when the formation leader is shot down and the remaining aircraft are being systematically destroyed, someone has to take command. I made the decision that I thought would give us the best chance of survival and mission completion. I was prepared to accept the consequences of that decision." General Crawford leaned forward in his chair. "And how did you know that your alternative approach would work?" "You were essentially improvising tactics in the middle of a combat situation." "It wasn't improvisation, sir," Sarah replied. "It was adaptation. I've studied German fighter tactics extensively, and I've observed their response patterns during previous missions. They tend to be very systematic in their approach, which means they're also predictable if you know what to look for. When I saw them setting up for a coordinated attack, I knew there would be gaps in their coverage that a small formation could exploit." The intelligence officer, Colonel James Bradley, consulted his notes. "Captain, your unconventional approach to the target area apparently caught the Germans completely off guard. According to our reconnaissance photos, the anti-aircraft defenses were all positioned to defend against attacks from the standard approach routes. You came in from a direction that left most of their guns out of position. That was intentional, sir," Sarah explained. "I noticed during the mission briefing that all of our previous attacks on that target had followed similar approach patterns. I suspected that the Germans would have adapted their defenses accordingly, so I chose an approach route that would minimize our exposure to their prepared positions." Major Thompson shook his head. "Captain, what you're describing sounds more like guesswork than tactical planning. You made a series of decisions based on hunches and instincts, not on established procedures or intelligence reports." Sarah felt the familiar frustration rising in her chest. Even after successfully completing an impossible mission, she was still being criticized for her methods. "Sir, with respect, established procedures and intelligence reports are based on standard operational assumptions. When those assumptions no longer apply, when the enemy has adapted their tactics, or when the mission parameters have changed, have to be able to adapt as well." "The captain has a point," General Crawford interjected. "Our standard procedures are designed for ideal conditions with full formations and air superiority. Captain Mitchell was operating with a reduced force, damaged aircraft, and no fighter escort. Under those circumstances, standard procedures might not have been the best option." The discussion continued for over 2 hours, with Sarah explaining in detail how she had used her understanding of aircraft performance, weather conditions, and enemy tactics to navigate through what should have been an impossible situation. Some of the officers seemed genuinely interested in her methods, while others remained skeptical of her unconventional approach. "Captain," Colonel Bradley said as the meeting was winding down, "I have to ask, where did you learn these tactics?" "They're not part of any official training program that I'm aware of," Sarah smiled slightly. I learned them from my aircraft, sir. Every plane has its own personality, its own strengths and weaknesses. If you take the time to understand what your aircraft is telling you, it will help you push the boundaries of what's possible. The comment brought a few chuckles from the assembled officers, but Sarah noticed that General Crawford wasn't laughing. Instead, he was studying her with an expression of genuine interest. "Captain Mitchell," the general said, "I want you to prepare a formal report on your tactics and methods. I'm going to send it up the chain of command, and I want to recommend that your techniques be studied and possibly incorporated into our training programs." Sarah felt a surge of hope, but it was tempered by the skeptical expressions on the faces of some of the other officers. She had won this battle, but the war for acceptance of her methods was far from over. After the meeting, Sarah walked back to her quarters, exhausted but cautiously optimistic. For the first time since joining the squadron, it seemed like her superiors were actually taking her seriously. But she also knew that one successful mission wouldn't be enough to change decades of military doctrine and prejudice. That evening, she was surprised to find a group of junior pilots waiting for her outside the officers' club. They had heard about the mission, and they wanted to know more about her tactics. Unlike the senior officers, these young pilots seemed genuinely eager to learn from her experience. Captain Mitchell, Lieutenant David Park, a fresh-faced pilot who had arrived at the base only 2 weeks earlier, said nervously, "We heard that you did something incredible out there. Could you teach us some of your techniques?" Sarah looked at the eager young faces surrounding her and realized that this was how real change happened, not through official channels and policy changes, but through individual pilots learning from each other and passing on their knowledge. These young men were the future of military aviation, and if she could teach them to think beyond the standard procedures, she might be able to make a real difference in the war effort. "All right," she said, "but we do this unofficially. I'll teach you what I know, but you have to promise me that you'll use your own judgment about when and how to apply these techniques. They're not magic formulas, they're tools that can help you survive in situations where the standard procedures aren't enough." As she looked at the enthusiastic faces of the young pilots, Sarah realized that her real victory wasn't the successful mission or the recognition from her superiors. It was the opportunity to pass on her knowledge to the next generation of aviators, ensuring that her hard-won expertise would continue to save lives long after the war was over. 6 months after the Regensburg mission, Sarah Mitchell had become something of a legend within the European theater of operations. Her unconventional tactics had been quietly adopted by several squadrons, and her success rate had attracted the attention of high-ranking officers throughout the Allied command structure. But with recognition came new challenges, and Sarah found herself facing pressures that she had never anticipated. "Captain Mitchell," General Crawford announced during a staff meeting, "I'm recommending you for promotion to major and assignment as squadron commander. Your innovative tactics have proven their worth, and I believe you're ready for greater responsibilities." The promotion should have been a moment of triumph, but Sarah felt a complex mix of emotions. She was grateful for the recognition, but she also understood that increased rank would bring increased scrutiny. As a captain, she had been able to operate with relative freedom, developing and refining her techniques without too much interference from higher headquarters. As a major and squadron commander, she would be expected to formalize her methods and apply them systematically across multiple crews. "Sir," she replied carefully, "I'm honored by your confidence, but I want to make sure that I can continue to develop and teach these techniques. I've been working with some of the junior pilots, and I think there's still a lot of potential for improvement in our tactical approaches." General Crawford nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I want to hear. The Army Air Forces is interested in establishing a formal training program based on your methods. We want you to head up the development of a new curriculum for advanced tactical flying." The assignment represented everything Sarah had hoped for when she first joined the WASP program. She would have the opportunity to influence the training of hundreds of pilots, potentially saving thousands of lives by teaching them to think beyond standard procedures. But she also knew that formalizing her methods would be a significant challenge. The techniques that worked for her were based on intuition, experience, and an almost mystical connection to her aircraft. How could she teach other pilots to develop that same level of sensitivity and judgment? How could she codify methods that were fundamentally about breaking the rules when the situation demanded it? "I'll need to select my own instructors," Sarah said. "The pilots who will be teaching these techniques need to understand them at a fundamental level, not just memorize a set of procedures." "Agreed," the general replied. "You'll have complete authority to structure the program however you think best. The only requirement is that it produces results." Over the following weeks, Sarah threw herself into the development of the new training curriculum. She worked with Lieutenant Park and several other pilots who had successfully applied her techniques. In combat, analyzing what worked and what didn't, trying to identify the core principles that could be taught to others. The process was more difficult than she had anticipated. Her methods were so deeply ingrained that she often found it hard to explain why she made certain decisions. When she flew, her responses were automatic, based on years of experience and an intuitive understanding of flight dynamics. But teaching others required her to break down those automatic responses into logical steps that could be understood and replicated. "The key," she explained to her hand-picked group of instructor pilots, "is learning to listen to what the aircraft is telling you. Every plane has its own personality, its own way of communicating its condition and capabilities. Your instruments will tell you what's happening, but the aircraft itself will tell you what's going to happen next." Lieutenant Park frowned. "But how do we teach someone to listen to an aircraft? That sounds more like mysticism than aviation." Sarah smiled. "It's not mysticism, Dave. It's applied physics and psychology. When you feel a vibration in the controls, that's the aircraft telling you something about its structural condition. When you hear a change in engine sound, that's information about performance and reliability. When you sense that the aircraft is handling differently than usual, that's data about aerodynamic changes or weight distribution." She spent hours with each instructor, flying with them and teaching them to recognize the subtle cues that most pilots ignored. It was exhausting work, but gradually she began to see results. The pilots who embraced her methods started to develop their own intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior, and their performance in challenging situations improved dramatically. But not everyone was receptive to her teaching. Some of the more traditional instructors resisted her methods, arguing that they were too subjective and unreliable for military training. The criticism came to a head during a demonstration flight that Sarah was conducting for a group of senior officers. Captain Mitchell, Colonel Harrison, no relation to the colonel who had been shot down over Germany, said with obvious skepticism, "What you're showing us might work for exceptionally skilled pilots, but most of our aircrew don't have your level of experience. We need training methods that will work for average pilots, not just for exceptional ones." Sarah felt the familiar frustration, but she also recognized the validity of the colonel's concern. Her methods did require a level of skill and judgment that not every pilot possessed. The question was whether those skills could be taught, or whether they were innate talents that only some pilots possessed. "Colonel," she replied, "I believe that most pilots have the potential to develop these skills if they're given the right training and encouragement. The problem is that our current training system discourages the kind of thinking that makes these techniques possible. We teach pilots to follow procedures and trust their instruments, but we don't teach them to think critically about unusual situations." The debate continued for several more months, with Sarah's supporters arguing for the adoption of her methods and her critics pushing for more traditional approaches. The resolution came in the form of a direct order from the Pentagon, the Army. Air forces would establish a formal advanced tactical flying school, with Sarah as the commandant, to test and refine her methods under controlled conditions. The school would be both an opportunity and a challenge. Sarah would have the resources and authority to develop her training methods properly, but she would also be under intense scrutiny from critics who were hoping to see her fail. The success or failure of the school would determine whether her techniques would be adopted throughout the Air Forces, or whether they would be dismissed as the eccentric methods of a single exceptional pilot. As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had started as a farm girl from Kansas who just wanted to fly, and she had become one of the most influential tactical instructors in the Army Air Forces. But her real achievement wasn't the recognition or the promotions. It was the knowledge that her methods were saving lives and helping pilots survive in situations where conventional training would have failed them. The war was far from over, and there would be many more challenges ahead. But Sarah was confident that her approach to flying based on understanding, intuition, and adaptation would continue to make a difference in the lives of the pilots she trained and the success of the missions they flew. The advanced, tactical flying school that Sarah established at Edwards Army Airfield in California became a proving ground for aviation innovation that would influence military flying for decades to come. But the real test of her methods came not in the controlled environment of the training facility, but in the skies over the Pacific, where her former students were putting her techniques to use in some of the most challenging flying conditions of the war. Lieutenant David Park, who had been one of Sarah's first students, found himself flying B-29 Superfortresses on long-range missions over Japan. The massive bombers were technological marvels, but they were also complex machines that required a level of understanding and finesse that went beyond standard operating procedures. Park had learned to listen to his aircraft the way Sarah had taught him, and that skill had already saved his life on multiple occasions. "Red Leader, this is Red 3. Park called over the radio during a mission over Tokyo. "I'm showing normal readings on all engines, but something doesn't feel right. Request permission to abort the mission." The mission commander, who had not been trained in Sarah's methods, was skeptical. "Red 3, all your instruments are showing normal. There's no reason to abort." But Park trusted his instincts, and more importantly, he trusted what Sarah had taught him about aircraft behavior. "Sir, Captain Mitchell taught me to pay attention to subtle changes in aircraft handling. I can feel something wrong with the airframe, even though the instruments don't show it." The mission commander was about to order Park to continue when the number 2 engine on Red 3 exploded in a ball of fire. Park's early warning had given him the precious seconds he needed to shut down the engine and maintain control of the aircraft. He made it home safely, and the post-mission inspection revealed fatigue cracks in the engine mount that would have caused catastrophic failure if the mission had continued. Similar stories were being reported from all over the Pacific theater. Pilots who had been trained in Sarah's methods were consistently outperforming their colleagues, not just in terms of mission success, but in terms of survival rates. The statistics were compelling enough that even her harshest critics had to acknowledge the effectiveness of her approach. Back at Edwards, Sarah was developing new training scenarios that pushed the boundaries of what was considered possible in military aviation. Her students were learning to fly damaged aircraft, to adapt to rapidly changing tactical situations, and to make split-second decisions based on incomplete information. Most importantly, they were learning to think for themselves rather than simply following prescribed procedures. "The goal," Sarah explained to a group of visiting generals, "isn't to replace standard procedures, but to prepare pilots for situations where standard procedures aren't enough. In combat, you can't always rely on your instruments, your radio, or your training manual. Sometimes you have to rely on your own judgment and your understanding of your aircraft." One of the visiting generals, a traditional aviator who had been skeptical of Sarah's methods, raised his hand. "Major Mitchell, what you're describing sounds like a recipe for chaos. If every pilot starts making their own decisions about tactics and procedures, how do we maintain unit cohesion and command authority? Sarah had heard this criticism many times before, and she had developed a response that addressed the underlying concerns while defending the validity of her approach. Sir, what I'm teaching isn't about ignoring orders or abandoning discipline. It's about developing the judgment and skills that allow pilots to execute their missions successfully under any circumstances. A pilot who understands his aircraft and his tactical environment is more likely to follow orders effectively, not less likely. The debate continued, but Sarah noticed that the tone had changed. Instead of dismissing her methods as dangerous or unworkable, her critics were now asking detailed questions about implementation and training standards. The success of her former students in combat had created a demand for her techniques that couldn't be ignored. As the war in the Pacific entered its final phase, Sarah received word that she was being considered for a new assignment that would take her beyond the realm of training and into the development of entirely new aircraft and tactical concepts. The Army Air Forces was planning for the post-war period, and they wanted her input on the design of next-generation aircraft and the training programs that would prepare pilots for the jet age. Major Mitchell, General Crawford said during a secure telephone call, "The Air Forces is about to undergo the most significant transformation in its history. Jet aircraft, radar-guided navigation, and new weapon systems are going to change everything about how we fly and fight. We need officers who can think beyond current limitations and help us prepare for a future that we can barely imagine." Sarah felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of new challenges and opportunities. Throughout her career, she had been pushing the boundaries of what was possible in aviation, always looking for ways to improve performance and save lives. Now she was being asked to help shape the future of military aviation itself. "Sir," she replied, "I'm honored by your confidence, but I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the fundamental principles that make good pilots. Technology will continue to advance, but the need for judgment, adaptability, and situational awareness will always be crucial." "That's exactly why we need you," the general replied. "We have plenty of engineers who can design new aircraft and plenty of technicians who can maintain them. But we need leaders who understand that the human element will always be the most important factor in aviation success." As Sarah prepared for her new assignment, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a farm in Kansas to a position of influence in the highest levels of military aviation. She had faced skepticism, criticism, and outright hostility from colleagues who couldn't understand her methods. But she had persevered, driven by her conviction that there was always a better way to fly, a safer way to complete the mission, and a more effective way to train pilots. The war was nearly over, but Sarah's real work was just beginning. The techniques she had developed and the principles she had established would continue to influence military aviation for generations to come. Her legacy wouldn't be measured in medals or promotions, but in the lives of the pilots she had trained and the missions they had completed successfully, because they had learned to think beyond the limitations of standard procedures. In the end, Sarah Mitchell had done more than prove that her unconventional flying style was effective. She had demonstrated that innovation, adaptability, and individual judgment were not obstacles to military discipline, but essential components of military effectiveness. Her story would inspire future generations of aviators to question assumptions, challenge limitations, and always strive for excellence in the pursuit of mission success and aircrew survival. The transition from propeller-driven aircraft to jet-powered flight represented more than just technological advancement. It demanded a complete rethinking of everything pilots thought they knew about aviation. For Sarah Mitchell, now promoted to major and assigned to the cutting-edge test programs at Edwards Air Force Base, it represented the ultimate validation of her career-long philosophy that rigid adherence to established procedures could never substitute for adaptive thinking and intuitive understanding. The sleek lines of the P-80 shooting star gleamed in the California desert sun as Sarah Mitchell walked around the aircraft for her pre-flight inspection. It was October 1945, and the war had officially ended just 2 months earlier, but Sarah's work was far from over. The jet age had arrived, and with it came challenges that would test everything she had learned about aviation over the past decade. Major Mitchell, Colonel Robert "Bob" Stevens, the test pilot program director, approached with a clipboard full of technical specifications. "This is going to be unlike anything you've flown before. The power-to-weight ratio is completely different from propeller aircraft, and the handling characteristics change dramatically at different airspeeds." Sarah nodded, but her attention was focused on the aircraft itself. Even without engines running, she could sense that this machine represented a fundamental shift in aviation technology. The swept wings, the streamlined fuselage, and the absence of a propeller all suggested flight characteristics that would require entirely new approaches to piloting technique. "What's the maximum airspeed?" she asked, running her hand along the wing root where it joined the fuselage. "Theoretically, about 600 miles per hour, Colonel Stevens replied. "But we haven't had a pilot willing to push it that hard yet. The aircraft becomes very sensitive to control inputs at high speeds, and the margins for error are much smaller than with conventional aircraft." Sarah smiled. Smaller margins for error was exactly the kind of challenge that had defined her entire career. Throughout the war, she had specialized in situations where conventional procedures weren't adequate, where pilots needed to rely on judgment, intuition, and an intimate understanding of their aircraft's capabilities. "Colonel," she said, "I'd like to start with some basic handling exercises at moderate speeds, then gradually work up to the aircraft's limits. But I want to approach this the same way I've approached every other aircraft I've flown, by learning to understand what it's trying to tell me." Colonel Stevens looked skeptical. "Major, this isn't a B-17 or a P-51. This is cutting-edge technology with flight characteristics that are completely outside the realm of conventional aviation experience. I'm not sure that your intuitive approach will apply to jet aircraft." Sarah had heard similar skepticism throughout her career, and it no longer bothered her. She had learned that the best way to answer critics was through results, not arguments. "Colonel, the fundamental principles of flight haven't changed, even if the technology has. An aircraft is still an aircraft, regardless of what powers it. It will still communicate its condition and capabilities to a pilot who knows how to listen." The first flight in the P-80 was a revelation. As Sarah lifted off from the runway at Edwards, she immediately noticed that the aircraft responded differently than any plane she had ever flown. The acceleration was smooth and linear, without the torque effects and power variations of propeller-driven aircraft. But more importantly, the aircraft seemed to want to fly at high speeds. It felt most comfortable when pushed to the limits of its performance envelope. "Edwards Tower, this is Shooting Star 01, Sarah called over the radio. "Climbing to 20,000 feet for handling evaluation." As she climbed, Sarah began the systematic process of learning the aircraft's personality that had served her so well throughout her career. She made gentle control inputs, feeling how the aircraft responded at different airspeeds and altitudes. She listened to the sound of the jet engine, learning to recognize the subtle variations that indicated different power settings and operating conditions. But what impressed her most was how the aircraft seemed to reward aggressive flying. Unlike the heavy bombers she had flown during the war, which required careful, deliberate control inputs, the P-80 responded best to confident, precise movements. It was as if the aircraft had been designed for pilots who were willing to push boundaries and explore new possibilities. "Shooting Star 01, this is Edwards Tower," the radio crackled. "Be advised that we're showing you at 450 miles per hour. That's faster than any of our previous test pilots have attempted." Sarah glanced at her airspeed indicator and realized that she had been so focused on the aircraft's handling characteristics that she hadn't noticed how fast she was flying. The P-80 had reached speeds that would have been impossible in any propeller aircraft, and it was doing so smoothly and controllably. "Tower, aircraft is handling normally," she replied. "Continuing speed evaluation." Over the next 30 minutes, Sarah pushed the P-80 through a series of maneuvers that explored its capabilities at various speeds and altitudes. She discovered that the aircraft had quirks and characteristics that weren't documented in any manual. Subtle changes in handling at different power settings, variations in control response at high altitudes, and most importantly, clear warning signs when the aircraft was approaching its limits. "The key," she explained to Colonel Stevens during the post-flight debriefing, "is recognizing that this aircraft wants to fly fast. It's most comfortable at high speeds, and it actually becomes easier to control as you approach its maximum performance. But you have to listen to what it's telling you about engine temperature, control loads, and structural stress." Colonel Stevens reviewed the data from the flight with obvious amazement. "Major, you achieved speeds and performed maneuvers that we thought would require months of gradual progression. How did you know that the aircraft could handle that level of stress?" Sarah smiled. "The same way I've always known, by paying attention to what the aircraft was telling me. This machine is designed to fly at high speeds, and it's actually safer when you're operating within its design envelope rather than trying to baby it along at conservative settings." The success of Sarah's initial flights in the P-80 led to her assignment as the lead test pilot for the entire jet aircraft evaluation program. Over the following months, she would fly prototype aircraft that pushed the boundaries of speed, altitude, and maneuverability. But more importantly, she would develop the training protocols and operational procedures that would prepare military pilots for the jet age. "What we're doing here," Sarah told a group of visiting Air Force generals, "isn't just testing new aircraft, we're defining the future of military aviation. The pilots who fly these machines will need to think differently, react faster, and understand their aircraft at a level that goes beyond anything we've required before." General Carl Toohey Spots, who had become the first chief of staff of the newly independent Air Force, nodded approvingly. "Major Mitchell, your work here is going to influence how we train pilots for the next 50 years. I want you to think beyond just test flying. I want you to help us design the entire structure of Air Force pilot training for the jet age." As Sarah looked out at the experimental aircraft lined up on the Edwards flight line, she realized that her career had come full circle. She had started as a young woman trying to prove that she belonged in military aviation, and she had become one of the most influential figures in shaping the future of flight. Her unconventional methods, which had once been criticized as dangerous and unreliable, were now being recognized as essential skills for the challenges that lay ahead. The war was over, but Sarah's real mission was just beginning. The techniques she had developed, the principles she had established, and the training methods she had pioneered would become the foundation for military aviation in the jet age and beyond. As she looked toward the future, she could see that the greatest challenges and opportunities still lay ahead. By 1950, the reputation of Sarah Mitchell's Test Pilot School had spread far beyond the boundaries of Edwards Air Force Base. Aviation experts from around the world were coming to study her methods, and her former students were setting records and pushing boundaries that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But Sarah's greatest challenge wasn't flying experimental aircraft. It was convincing a new generation of pilots that the impossible was merely another word for not yet accomplished. The Experimental Flight Test School at Edwards Air Force Base had become the most prestigious assignment in military aviation, and Sarah Mitchell found herself at the center of a revolution in pilot training that would influence generations of aviators. But her greatest challenge wasn't flying experimental aircraft or pushing the boundaries of technology. It was teaching other pilots to embrace the same unconventional thinking that had defined her entire career. "Gentlemen," Sarah addressed, "a class of test pilot candidates. You've all been selected because you're exceptional pilots with outstanding records. But what got you here won't be enough to succeed in this program. You're going to have to learn to think differently about flying, about aircraft, and about the very nature of what's possible in aviation." The class consisted of 12 pilots, all men, all with extensive combat experience from the recently concluded war. They looked at Sarah with a mixture of respect and skepticism. Respect for her legendary reputation, but skepticism about whether a woman could teach them anything they didn't already know about flying. Captain James "Rock" Hudson, a former P-51 pilot with 23 confirmed kills, raised his hand. "Major Mitchell, with all due respect, most of us have been flying for years. We've survived combat, mastered our aircraft, and proven ourselves under the most challenging conditions. What exactly are you going to teach us that we don't already know?" Sarah had expected this attitude, and she had prepared for it. "Captain Hudson, I'm going to teach you to forget everything you think you know about flying. You've mastered conventional aircraft using conventional techniques, but the aircraft we're going to be testing require approaches that go beyond conventional thinking." She walked over to a blackboard where she had drawn a simple diagram of an aircraft in level flight. "Tell me, Captain, what determines the maximum speed of an aircraft?" Hudson looked puzzled by the simplicity of the question. "Engine power, aerodynamic drag, and structural limitations, ma'am. That's what the textbooks say," Sarah replied. "But what really determines maximum speed is the pilot's willingness to push the aircraft to its absolute limits, and more importantly, the pilot's ability to recognize when those limits are being approached. The aircraft will tell you when it's reaching its maximum capabilities, but only if you know how to listen." Over the following weeks, Sarah put the test pilot candidates through a training program unlike anything they had ever experienced. Instead of focusing on technical procedures and standardized techniques, she taught them to develop an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that went far beyond conventional pilot training. "Close your eyes," she instructed during one particularly intense training session. "I want you to tell me what this aircraft is doing, based solely on what you can feel and hear." The students sat in the cockpit of a P-80 with their eyes closed, while Sarah manipulated the controls from the instructor's position. One by one, they called out airspeed changes, altitude variations, and power settings based on the subtle cues they were learning to recognize. "Very good, Lieutenant Parker," Sarah said as one student correctly identified a series of complex maneuvers. "You're beginning to understand that the aircraft is constantly communicating with you. Your instruments will tell you what happened, but your senses will tell you what's about to happen." The breakthrough came during a high-speed flight test in which Captain Hudson was attempting to push a prototype fighter to its maximum velocity. Following conventional procedures, he had been gradually increasing speed while carefully monitoring his instruments. But as he approached what the manual indicated was the aircraft's maximum safe speed, Sarah's voice came over the radio with advice that contradicted everything he had been taught. "Rock, your instruments are telling you that you're at maximum speed, but your aircraft is telling you something different. Listen to the engine sound, feel the control response, pay attention to the vibration patterns. This machine wants to go faster." Hudson hesitated. Every instinct trained into him during years of military flying told him to respect the published limitations and avoid exceeding recommended parameters. But he had also learned to trust Sarah's judgment, and her track record of success was undeniable. "I'm going to push it," he announced over the radio. As Hudson advanced the throttle beyond the recommended setting, he felt the aircraft respond with an eagerness that surprised him. Instead of the rough handling and dangerous vibrations he had expected, the fighter became smoother and more responsive. He had broken through a psychological barrier that had been limiting his understanding of the aircraft's true capabilities. "Outstanding!" Sarah's voice crackled over the radio. "You just flew that aircraft 20 miles per hour faster than anyone has ever flown it before, and you did it safely because you listened to what it was telling you." The success of Hudson's flight marked a turning point in the test pilot program. The students began to understand that Sarah wasn't teaching them to ignore safety procedures or take unnecessary risks. She was teaching them to recognize when their understanding of an aircraft's limitations was incomplete or incorrect. "The goal," Sarah explained during a lecture to senior Air Force officers, "isn't to create reckless pilots who ignore established procedures. It's to develop aviators who can adapt to situations that go beyond the scope of any manual or training program." In test flying, as in combat, you often encounter situations that have never been faced before. Standard procedures can only take you so far. The success of Sarah's training methods led to requests from other branches of the military and even from foreign air forces who wanted to learn her techniques. But Sarah insisted that the principles she taught couldn't be reduced to a simple set of procedures or rules. "What I'm teaching," she told a gathering of international aviation experts, "is a way of thinking about flying that emphasizes understanding over memorization, adaptation over rigid adherence to procedures, and most importantly, trust in the pilot's ability to make good decisions under pressure." As the test pilot program at Edwards gained international recognition, Sarah found herself being consulted on aircraft design, training protocols, and operational procedures that would influence military aviation for decades to come. But her greatest satisfaction came from watching her former students apply the techniques she had taught them to push the boundaries of what was considered possible in aviation. The principles Sarah had developed through years of unconventional flying were becoming the foundation for a new approach to pilot training that emphasized critical thinking, situational awareness, and the development of advanced flying skills that went far beyond basic aircraft operation. Her legacy was being written not just in the record books of experimental flight, but in the minds and capabilities of the pilots she had trained. And as the space age dawned on the horizon, those capabilities would be tested in ways that even Sarah could barely imagine. The letter arrived on a crisp October morning in 1960, bearing the seal of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. As Sarah Mitchell, now a brigadier general, read the formal request for her assistance in developing training protocols for astronauts, she realized that her journey from a mocked female pilot to a pioneer of human flight was about to enter its most extraordinary chapter. 20-5 years after Sarah Mitchell first stepped into a cockpit at that small airfield in Kansas, she stood on the observation deck at Edwards Air Force Base watching the sleek F-104 starfighter streak across the desert sky at nearly twice the speed of sound. The pilot flying that aircraft was one of her former students, now a colonel, executing maneuvers that would have been unimaginable when she first began teaching her unconventional methods. Major General Mitchell, the voice belonged to General Curtis LeMay, who had become one of the most influential leaders in the newly formed Strategic Air Command. "I wanted to personally thank you for what you've accomplished here. The pilots graduating from your program are consistently outperforming everyone else in the Air Force." Sarah smiled as she watched the F-104 execute a perfect high-speed turn that demonstrated the pilot's complete mastery of an aircraft that was notoriously difficult to fly. "General, what we've accomplished here isn't magic. It's simply the result of teaching pilots to think for themselves and to develop a deeper understanding of their aircraft than traditional training methods provide." The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another familiar figure, Lieutenant Colonel David Park, now the deputy commander of the test pilot school that Sarah had built from nothing. "General Mitchell," he said, "we just received word that the X-15 program has been approved." They want you to head up the pilot selection and training for rocket-powered flight. Sarah felt the familiar thrill that came with the prospect of exploring new frontiers in aviation. The X-15 would be capable of flying at speeds exceeding 4,000 miles per hour and reaching altitudes that would take pilots to the edge of space itself. It would require flying skills and judgment that went far beyond anything that had been attempted before. "Dave," she said, "when I first started teaching pilots to listen to their aircraft, people thought I was talking about some kind of mystical connection. Now we're preparing to fly aircraft that will operate in environments where traditional flight controls don't even work. If there was ever a time when pilots needed to understand their machines at the deepest possible level, this is it." As Sarah began planning the training program for X-15 pilots, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a criticized female pilot to one of the most influential figures in military aviation. The techniques she had developed out of necessity and intuition had become the foundation for an entirely new approach to pilot training that was now being adopted by air forces around the world. But perhaps more importantly, her story had helped to break down barriers that had prevented other women from pursuing careers in aviation. The Women's Air Force had been established as a permanent part of the military, and female pilots were beginning to find opportunities that had been unthinkable just a decade earlier. General Mitchell, Colonel Sarah Johnson, one of the first women to graduate from the test pilot school, approached with obvious excitement. "I just wanted to let you know that I've been selected for the X-15 program. I'll be the first woman to fly a rocket-powered aircraft." Sarah felt a deep sense of pride and satisfaction. The barriers she had helped to break down were opening doors for a new generation of female aviators who would face their own challenges, but would also have opportunities that she could never have imagined when she first put on a flight suit. "Sarah," she said, using the colonel's first name in recognition of their shared bond as pioneers in aviation, "you're going to face skepticism and criticism just like I did. But remember what I've always taught: trust your instincts, listen to your aircraft, and never let anyone convince you that there's only one way to solve a problem." As the years passed, Sarah's influence on military aviation continued to grow. The pilots she had trained became squadron commanders, test pilots, and eventually generals who carried her philosophy of adaptive thinking and innovative problem-solving to every corner of the Air Force. Her methods were no longer considered unconventional. They had become the standard by which all advanced pilot training was measured. The ultimate vindication of Sarah's approach came during the early years of the space program, when pilots trained in her methods became the first to successfully pilot spacecraft in the hostile environment of space. The same intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that had helped her survive combat missions in World War II proved to be essential for pilots operating in the vacuum of space, where traditional flight controls were useless and survival depended on understanding the subtle cues provided by spacecraft systems. "You know," Sarah said to Park as they watched another group of test pilot candidates begin their training, "when I first started teaching pilots to think beyond standard procedures, I thought I was just trying to help them survive in combat. I never imagined that those same techniques would be essential for spaceflight." Park nodded thoughtfully. "General, what you really taught us was how to learn from our aircraft, how to adapt to new situations, and how to trust our own judgment when the book doesn't have an answer. Those skills are just as important in space as they were over Germany." As Sarah looked out at the experimental aircraft on the Edwards flightline jets, rockets, and prototypes that pushed the boundaries of technology, she realized that her greatest achievement wasn't any single flight or mission. It was the legacy of pilots who had learned to think creatively, adapt to changing circumstances, and never accept that something was impossible simply because it had never been done before. The young woman who had been mocked for her flying style had become the teacher of pilots who would explore the edges of the atmosphere and beyond. Her unconventional methods, born from necessity and refined through years of experience, had become the foundation for a new generation of aviators who would push the boundaries of human flight, farther than anyone had ever dreamed possible. Sarah Mitchell's story was no longer just about one pilot's struggle for acceptance. It had become the story of how innovative thinking and the courage to challenge conventional wisdom could transform an entire field of human endeavor. From the skies over war-torn Europe to the edge of space itself, her influence would continue to guide pilots who dared to explore the impossible. In the end, Sarah had proven that the most important instrument in any aircraft wasn't found on the panel. It was the mind of the pilot who had learned to think beyond limitations and see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Her legacy would live on in every pilot who ever looked at a seemingly impossible situation and found a way to make it work, and in every aviator who remembered that sometimes the best way forward is the path that no one else has ever tried. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.